Welcome to the October 4th, 2023 edition of the Smart Energy Decisions webinar series. I'm Deborah Channel, Research and Content Director at Smart Energy Decisions. Our webinar series has been developed to deliver insights and useful information for our large electric power users. Today's presentation, brought to us by Trane, is Overcoming the Biggest Hurdle in Decarbonizing Buildings. And our presenter today is Becky Wacker, Trane's Director of Energy Services Sales for the Americas. You know, sometimes the first step in any journey is the toughest. So it's really not surprising that the biggest roadblock in your building decarbonization strategy might just be how to get started. So in this webinar, Becky's going to talk to us about the importance of identifying your Northstar, how to take advantage of funding opportunities, and how to understand the levers that you need to pull to decarbonize your buildings. And I just want to say, Becky just presented at our recent Net Zero Forum, and it was a terrific session. So we're very lucky to have her with us again today. But before we get started, let's do our usual housekeeping details. Make sure to enable pop-ups within your browser and turn on your system's sound to hear the streaming presentation. If you need any technical assistance, you can press the F5 key or Control R to refresh your browser. And if that doesn't do it, click the help link or submit a question and we'll respond right away. Speaking of that, submitting a question, on the console, you'll see if you want to submit a question at any time during the presentation, you can type it into that enter a question box, and we'll leave time at the end for a Q&A, and we'll also follow up offline if we don't get to your question during the live broadcast. And you'll also see on your console a series of case studies that Trane provided. You can download those and read them all. They're really well done. So check out the navigation bar at the bottom of your screen with all those widgets, and you'll know what to do. All right, let's talk a little bit about Smart Energy Decisions and everything we offer our community. We are very mission driven, and that mission is to help those large power users, commercial, industrial, institutional, and government, to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy, facilitate the development of their net zero roadmaps and other sustainability strategies, and share best practices in energy efficiency and sourcing. This ongoing webinar series is one of many programs and services that we produce, all in the quest to fulfill our mission. We have 2 podcast series, we have exclusive research, our daily news and newsletters, which if you haven't signed up for, please do. And of course, we have our events. I mentioned the Net Zero Forum where Becky spoke, and that was our final event for 2023. And we're already looking ahead to 2024. So you'll see we have our Net Zero Spring in February in Woodlands, Texas, that's outside of Houston. We've got our Renewable Energy Forum in June. That's in Aventura, Florida, outside of Miami. And in September, we'll have another Net Zero. That will be the fall edition. And that's in Westminster, Colorado. And for more information on all of that, please go to smartenergydecisions.com/events. Now let's get started with today's presentation. Again, it's Overcoming the Biggest Hurdle in Decarbonizing Buildings. And our presenter is Becky Wacker, as I said, Trane's Director of Energy Services Sales for the Americas. And before I bring Becky on, we want to start with a poll to get a little bit of information about our audience today. So take a look at this question. What has been the hardest part about your company's decarbonization journey so far? I'm going to ask you to choose one. We don't know where to start. We are inundated with solutions and don't know how to evaluate them. We know what we need to do, but we don't know how to get there. We don't have sufficient teams to execute on our plans. We are struggling to evaluate investments and figure out how to pay for them. Or is it other? Is it something else? So take a moment, select one, the biggest hurdle that you're facing at the moment in terms of building decarbonization. And we will give you a chance to select your answer, and then I'm going to bring Becky in and we are going to see what you all have to say today. And all right, countdown begins. 5, 4, 3, 2, get that answer in quick. And here we go. Let's see what our audience has to tell us today. So, other, okay, there's a lot of others in there, and I know Becky's going to be talking about a lot of different a lot of different issues here, so I'm sure we'll cover yours. But the biggest answer at 26.5%, we are struggling to evaluate investments and figure out how to pay for them. Show me the money. It's always at the top of the list. I'm not completely surprised. We don't have sufficient teams to execute on our plans, at about 15%. We don't know where to start, about 12%. And we are inundated with solutions and don't know how to evaluate them at about 9%. And then a small percentage say we know what we need to do, but we don't know how to get there. So Becky, any surprises on these answers?
No, Deborah, when I look at the answers here, I talk about math a lot. I'm an aerospace engineer, so I kind of think in numbers. So I certainly appreciate, the ability to evaluate investments and, how we pay for these opportunities is truly a key component of what we're wrestling with as an industry right now. And then as you see, other is such a broad category. Now it's also, a space that we spend a lot of time in, is uncovering what that other is and how it may filter into different categories. So really doesn't surprise me too much, being inundated with solutions and not knowing how to evaluate them, as well as knowing we know what to do, but we don't know how to get there. Those are really similar in terms of, we think we've got a feel for the solution, or we think we know what we need to do. Evaluating and then executing can be a really tricky part of that puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And with that, now we've heard from the audience. Becky, you're our expert today. Let's hear from you and let's get started.
All right, Deborah, I love having you kick me off for these webinars. I think I need to bring you to all of my presentations that I do. You do such a great job of setting it up. So thank you for doing that. As Deborah mentioned, I'm the Director of Sales for Energy Services at Trane, and I've been in the building space for about 15 years. And I'm just so thrilled and excited to talk about decarbonizing buildings, because we're really in that advent of time where we're making a transition, and this is becoming a reality for us, and we're moving towards something that's truly exciting. So when we put the agenda today, I know folks like to see a roadmap of where we're going in life, in decarbonizing, and within presentations. So what are you going to experience today? We're going to talk about organizational change as we move through sustainability initiatives. It's really important for alignment. We're going to touch on some of the levers for decarbonization and what that means and what that vernacular is that we work through, and then some of those solutions. We're going to talk about prioritization and sequencing for achieving our goals. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, based on the poll results here, we're going to talk about implementation, funding, and some of the financing options. So as Deborah mentioned, there is a question and answer feature. So go ahead and throw those in there as we go along. And, at the end, we'll try to tackle as many as we can. So as I mentioned, I've been doing this for about 15 years within the building space. And I do see a nexus, if you will, in a transition. We've been talking about our ambitions as an industry, as organizations, as companies around what decarbonization or sustainability means to us. We've been setting these big goals, and now we're really in this time period of, we've set the goals. Now, how do we get the results? How do we move into that action space? And so when we think about those that are setting the ambitions, it's a lot of times we're seeing it come from executive leadership. We're seeing it come from investor relations, folks that are really great at setting smart goals and then charting a path for their organization and then handing it to others to go execute. And so I say smart goals, right? Time bound with something that's measurable of what we're trying to achieve. And so many of our organizations do have a time period. We have a target and we know what we're trying to do, but now we're into that action era. And so we have to go get results. And within an organization, it's not just one person or one organization that we can hand it to. It's a number of organizations that end up being involved. Of course, when we're talking about decarbonizing buildings, we've got facilities and operations, but marketing and communications plays a big role. Environmental health and safety, a lot of times EH&S plays a big role in this. Procurement certainly, how do we buy this? And then finance and accounting is how does it make sense? And how do we do the math behind what we're trying to get done? And often we see there's a bridge between these two teams, and that becomes that sustainability team. And we're working through with those groups, and they're working through within their organizations to try to drive this change. So we talked about within the poll, some of the challenges that folks often face. And when I work with customers, when my teams work with customers, quite often it is that organizational complexity or working through the organizational structures in order to make this a reality for your organization. So as we talk about that complexity, let's go a little bit deeper into it. So I mentioned a lot of different roles within organizations. Sometimes you can call them business units. Sometimes you call them functions. Sometimes you call them silos. Sometimes you call them partners. Sometimes you call them folks that are a little bit challenging to work with. It can go through a lot of different iterations. But really, it's everybody who's aligned within your organization to try to get your mission done. And so they all have something within it. Deborah and I have talked about it before, WIFMs. It's one of my favorite sayings is what's in it for me. And all of these different folks and all these different functions, if you will, have different WIFMs. So when you think about things like brand perception, it's what do we want our customers to think about when they think of us? It could be a quality product. It could be that we stand by the environment. It could be our decarbonization efforts. It could be the entirety of that package, right? I think we can all think of some different companies or products that we buy or maybe don't buy that stand for something. And it stands for something more than just buying that thing and that tool for what you use, but it's something that stands for who you are as an individual. We also have shareholder value. When you think about setting these targets and what that means as an organization, do we have the capacity and capability to look at what decarbonization means for our business, for what it means for the planet, for what it means for how we're going to serve our organization's mission, as well as can we sustain that? And can we have things like resilience play into it such that we are a more resilient company and we can be more profitable while bringing in things like brand perception. There's also things like employee retention. I work for Trane, which is under the Trane Technologies umbrella. We're a global climate innovator, and that plays a big role in attracting employees to come and work for us. When we go to college fairs, when we go to different organizations where we're recruiting, when we're out there pinging folks on LinkedIn to see if they'd like to work with us, a lot of times that resonates with them and they get excited about that, and they get excited to come and talk to us about what our organization can mean. It also helps us retain employees, right? When I look at my team, there's many that are very excited about the fact that we live in this decarbonization space. And we also have a lot of folks that are very excited about either decarbonizing Trane's facilities, our factories, or working with customers to help them decarbonize, or looking at, broadly speaking, their role within all of those pieces of the organization. And so as we think about what it costs to either hire employees or keep employees, there's a lot there. There's also that motivation for what gets you up in the morning, what brings you to work, how excited are you about what you do. That gets that extra juice, if you will, from your employees, more so than I think a pizza party might, right? Being aligned to that organization and that mission. And so, if you can get 85% from someone instead of 75%, what does that mean for your organization? So with those great and exciting things that you can get on top of the ambitions that we've set out, just in terms of the decarbonization number and what that means, there's also those competing challenges down at the bottom in terms of competing investments. Right, all of our organizations are in the business of doing something within our mission, right? In terms of, if you think about a school or you think about a hospital, your schools are in their mission is to educate students. Hospitals' mission is to heal patients. Factories' missions are to create widgets and get them out the door as effectively as possible. And so there are investments that compete with our decarbonization goals. In terms of, thinking about K-12, we've all spent some time there buying new desks or buying new technology or hiring teachers are investments that compete with decarbonization of school facility. Same thing with factories or commercial buildings. What are those investments that are competing with it? There's also cost. We talked about that in the poll. I like to talk about the new math around decarbonization. What does it cost to do these projects? And how do we do the math around that? How do we pull in brand perception, employee retention, shareholder value, et cetera, on top of just the flat out utility savings? And then from a resources standpoint, some of those questions around, do we have the people to chart our path? Do we have the people to execute this? Do we have the capabilities and the resources to get that done? It's all very key challenges that we need to work through. And so what I often talk to organizations about before we even get started on talking about numbers or what their ambition may be, certainly they have a target and we have a time. We talk about that North Star. And what does decarbonization mean for the mission of your organization? Why are you doing it other than just because you've set a target and somebody told you to? Very few people get motivated, and very few initiatives are completed because you were just told to go do something. So when you think about that North Star, it's tying in what are the other things that you can achieve through the dollars that you're going to spend in your decarbonization efforts. I talked about employee retention being some of your organization's mission and who you are as an organization. It doesn't have to be that you're out there decarbonizing for your customers. It could be that you're an environmentally friendly company, but it could also be we have great facilities for our customers. So as we're going through decarbonization projects, are we improving our facilities for our employees? Are we helping them get excited to come back to work, and many of those other challenges? And so driving to that North Star and really spending time to kick the tires around it and make sure that the concrete has dried, if you will, on that North Star does a couple things. One, it gets a lot of people behind what you're trying to achieve. And so now they know how it relates to them and what their role is in it. And then the other piece that it really helps with is decision making. We all know that humans suffer from decision fatigue. So as you're trying to make decisions going through your decarbonization process and your projects and the different initiatives that will come into play, how do you make sure that that decision can be streamlined and that you have a singular North Star that you're going back to say, does this meet that need? Does this meet that criteria? And then it allows many of the decisions to flow downhill more streamlined from there. And that's where it all ties together. You've got your goal. You've got what your executives have set out. You've got the communication. You've got that excitement around what you're trying to achieve. And you see how many of these other groups tie into your project, what they're going to achieve. And now you've got a group that's all on board. I hope everybody's phone is off because I can hear out in the space around me the alarms going off. But with that, now we can move into results with that North Star aligning us. So you've set your North Star. You've understood your silos are aligned. Your organization understands why and how this relates into your business mission, your mission to decarbonize as well within your facilities. Where do you start stepping into that? And how do you go and find the expertise to help you find those solutions? So I'm going to spend some time here talking about the levers to decarbonizing facilities, right? You can get really nerdy in some of these things, and I will resist the temptation the best that I can. But one of the challenges that I do see is working the problem backwards. And so often when organizations first start talking about decarbonizing, and this is across the entire spectrum, often they think about renewables first. And really the challenge is you can't out renewable the decarbonization challenge. You can't do enough offsets for XP PPAs. Often you can't buy enough renewables to offset the entire load of not only the energy intensity of your buildings, but also your process. So what we do is we spend a lot of time saying, yes, renewables play a big role, and they're very identifiable as decarbonization. So some of those things like brand perception and employee perception of your organization is enhanced by renewables. But the most cost-effective decarbonization effort, or the best CO2 emission reduction impact and most cost-effective, is one you don't use and one that you don't need to offset with renewables. So we work with our customers and we often say, let's think about reducing your energy consumption first. And so that's looking at how are you using utilities within your space. And there's often a lot of cost savings here. And it's a space that we've been doing for a very long time, but we've had narrow bands within what is acceptable in the energy efficiency space. And by acceptable, I mean a project that pencils out financially. So often we've seen ROIs in that 3 to 5 year time span. And as we start thinking about decarbonizing, the goal is to understand what is the most cost effective pound of CO2 or ton or whatever metric you want to use. What's the most cost effective way that you can get there? And so we spend time looking at that and understanding that new math of how does this tie in. So that's a great place to start, is how little energy can you use. And one of the other things that we spend time with our customers doing is understanding the condition of their facilities and all of the different assets they have. What does your lighting look like? Is it in good shape? Does it need to be replaced? Is it an energy hog? Do you have a lot of different color lights that are going on in your space? Can you improve your indoor environment quality while you're tackling some of these energy consumption challenges? The next space is looking at minimizing your on-site emissions, scope 1, if you will. That's electrifying your equipment. I happen to be in LA today, where it's quite warm, and it was 90 degrees in Minneapolis, where I live, 2 days ago, which is very unusual in October. But very shortly it's going to be quite cold, and we're going to start burning a lot of fossil fuels, and that is not a great way to decarbonize any of our facilities in the north. So looking at how can we electrify our heat and move away from burning fossil fuels is really key. There's also mitigating your fugitive emissions. And then once you've solved that, once you've figured out how you can reduce your utilities, how you can, in some case, increase your electrical usage, now you can start thinking about your on-site renewables, what makes sense, where you want to apply it, where it works within your facility. And then lastly, addressing those difficult to abate emissions in terms of offsets and VPPAs. So we have an example project here, or an example customer, if you will, because this really helps exemplify what we see from our customers and some of the challenges that are out there. Now, this is not an exact customer. We grabbed a few different locations for example's sakes, and I'm not going to go really deep into each one of the locations, but it helps you get a span for how you evaluate these projects and what those pieces look like. So this example customer has a goal of becoming net zero by 2040, really common goal that we see out there. They've got a combination of production facilities, warehouses, office spaces, retail, et cetera. There's different laws, regulations, utility incentives, et cetera, across the different cities and states where they're located. And they have a variety of funding options. So when you look at this customer, you look at this subset of buildings, the question becomes, where do you start? So when you look at this slide, what I want you to take away from this is really you need to look at the broad spectrum of facilities. So I mentioned early on that one of the challenges we see with our customers is at times they look at using renewables first, and they say, can we out renewable our problem? Can they out renewable their decarbonization efforts? And often the answer to that is no, there's just not enough there. The other challenge we see is customers looking at the horizontal stack, or the vertical stack or the horizontal stack. And what I mean by that is they say, well, let's pick one facility and let's go top to bottom and all of the different levers that we can pull. And so they'll say, well, what does that look like? So when they go through it, when you look at the first option that you pull, the most cost effective, it is very cost effective. But as you go deeper into that stack, it gets more and more expensive. The other challenge we see is saying, hey, let's pick one technology and go all the way across. So they may say, let's pick lighting, and we go all the way across all of our facilities and do a lighting retrofit project. And you see that same challenge from a horizontal perspective. As you go left to right, those emissions that you can reduce get more and more expensive. And so what's really key here is to look at all of the different options and get there quickly to find that space around what are the different decarbonization measures, if you will. So that's a combination of reducing your energy consumption, your on-site emissions, looking at renewables, et cetera, and spanning that across all of your locations, all of your buildings, and really understanding what makes sense. So now you can start picking off the most cost effective, whether it's in that horizontal or vertical stack. From there, the other key thing that you need to look at is, depending on the different locations you're in, we certainly all know about the federal incentives that are out there. Within the IRA, there's the alphabet soup of incentives that you can pull from, and they're wonderful, and there's a lot of great opportunities. They're also complex to navigate. They're new, and really understanding how you bring in great teammates to help you evaluate what technology will fit in there and how does that fit your financial and accounting practices is very much key. And the sooner you can get there, the more likely it is to be approved. The other space is, as you look into states and cities, we're seeing the local governments get more and more involved in throwing money towards decarbonization and sustainability. And so as you approach different states or different cities, there are different incentives that you can leverage. Also, looking at utilities, some utilities are further along on trying to move towards hitting different targets around renewable energy, as well as encouraging their customers to drive out energy usage within their buildings. And so looking at those rebates, looking at the tax incentives, and then also the grants that are available within the different industries that you may be in and the different opportunities you have. So now as you start looking at all of the different decarbonization measures, energy conservation measures, on-site emissions levers that you need to pull, and applying in those different places where you can go get money. So what does it cost, and how can you get some free money to help offset the cost of those projects? Now you've got a really great opportunity to say, this is the scope and this is the span of all of the projects that we need to create and accomplish and execute in order to hit our overall savings targets. So often you then need to move into prioritizing your sequencing. As you look at the different incentives available and the different rebates, the different ways that you can pay for it, and the time that it takes to execute, spanning out to understand how long does that take, when should we do it, where should we apply that in, also understanding how your facilities are used. So I talked about that Northstar. You can't let that go to waste once you start getting into that execution portion. It's very important to say our Northstar is this. What is our mission? How do we execute it? As a very silly but straightforward example, you really don't want to go replace all of the lights in your K-12 facility in, say, I don't know, October, when all the students are there. There's times where you want to sequence that. Same thing within an industrial customer. There are often times where they have a plant shut down, or they have a time that they can be more effective in executing on a project. Same thing with office space. How do you want to sequence through it, and how do you be the least disruptive possible? So it's really key to say, we need to step through and understand when we get pieces done, what's the most effective way to do it, and where do we get the most bang for our buck, if you will. So certainly there's the pieces around flat out the ROI and what we're doing. There's also the space within, where do we get the most marketing? Where do we get the most employee retention? Where do you get the most brand recognition? In this case, you may see site one, that could be corporate headquarters, and you may choose to do a lot of work there because you can get that big bang for your buck around the other pieces that we talked about within the Northstar. And this is how you would sequence through to get to your final solution within that with your building portfolio. So you think about all of that work to be done. You've got all of these energy conservation measures. You've identified what you need to execute. You've gone through and you've selected all of the green dots and maybe some of the yellow dots that are required to hit your target. Now you have to think about, well, how do we make that happen? How do you actually work through that within the construction industry, if you will, or those that are going to come and execute the work? Very simplistically, I'm going to talk through two different options. I'm going to talk about a disaggregated and programmatic approach for accomplishing this. So we'll start talking about disaggregated. It's a really big word. It's kind of fun to say, which is why I use it a lot. But it's a fancy way to say design, bid, build. And so this is very familiar within the construction industry. This is where you would often hire an architect and engineer. You'd get contractors, and they would come in and execute the work. And so when you think through what that means, there's a couple of benefits that you work through from that. Potentially, you have lower first costs. And by potentially, I'm not trying to cop out on what that means. What I'm driving at is when you're designing a design bid build project, what you're going to do is say, well, here's the scope of work that we want to do for this project. And then you bring in bidders, and their goal within that scope of work is to execute it at the lowest possible cost for you. So they're not necessarily tying back to what is your decarbonization target and how do I play a role in hitting that larger target that you need to hit, or making sure that I'm covering your risk for it. They're trying to drive out cost. So as you see, when you look at that chart on the left-hand side where it says disaggregated, and we must start moving into who owns the risk for decarbonization, in the disaggregated approach, you as the client or you as the organization own the risk for that decarbonization. So if you don't meet your target, if these projects don't meet your target, that's on you to figure out what you do next to solve it. And so you may choose upfront to over design, so add in a risk factor. So maybe you aim for 10% more emission reduction, or maybe 25% or 5%, but that impacts your first cost. The other benefit to this approach is the familiarity of the procurement process. And my marketing department loves to mess with me if I throw that word in there because I can never say it right. But the procurement process is very common. Frankly, we often use it in our spaces, right? If I wanted to build a new deck at my house, I would go in and get a design of what I like, and I would go and look at some contractors. Same thing, we often build schools and we do retrofits in this way. Now, looking at some of the drawbacks, I mentioned the risk is assumed by the client. So you would own that risk. The other space is it likely requires capital funding. So it's likely going to be on your balance sheet when you look at how you're going to pay for what happens. You are going to have to coordinate the staffing. So when you think about all those green dots and all those yellow dots that I showed before, depending on how well they're packaged together, there's going to be a number of projects being led by a number of different contractors on your sites. And so you need to be able to coordinate that, as well as if you happen to be a customer like the one I showed in this example, who's spread across multiple states, multiple regions, multiple countries, you're now needing to balance out a lot of different folks doing a lot of different projects. And so there's a lot of necessary organizational drag just in staying on top of all of that. You also need to manage all the procurement. There's many different statistics out there, but I've heard as high as 25% of a project cost is in that procurement process and the internal work that it takes to make sure that it gets done. And then, the last piece there is establishing that consistent measurement program. Because you own the risk of proving you're getting the outcomes, you own the measurement process. So you can certainly hire consultants to help you with that, but it's a piece that you need to be able to measure if you're going to be able to report out on it. So to compare the disaggregated approach, you also have the programmatic approach. And so this could be called a performance contract. You could have heard of it as an ESPC. You also may have heard as an energy as a service or an EAS. Those are just different ways to pay for it within that programmatic approach. But what it essentially means is one singular entity, as an example, Trane would own all of that risk. So if we say that we need to get a decarbonization target of, just make it up a silly number, 50, then Trane owns finding that 50 and making sure we hit it. From a first cost perspective, again, I talked through that a little bit in the last slide, but depending on how you design for it, you could have more or less first cost. From a speed perspective, when you're in the disaggregated approach, the more contractors, the more contracts you need to cut, the more complicated it is, the more drag you have in your organization, the more expensive and the more time-bound it becomes, versus working in a programmatic approach, one provider, one contract, one program to go execute all of it. The staffing coordination, you all can see, looking at the provider is now the one spanning all of those different sites, spanning all of those different red, green, and yellow dots. And then we can look at how you pay for it from a budget perspective. Now you have the opportunity to either use capital expense or move into that operational expense. So what do I mean by faster outcome to delivery? I think I hit that really strong in that last slide, but it's really important to understand when you're working through procurement, and as you think about some of the WIFMs within your business, to say, hey, procurement, why do we want to decarb and how can I make it easy for you? This is one way that we can help streamline it and make sure, of course, that you're working with a great provider, with a great program and a great approach. but now you can streamline how you can get those projects done. Having someone take on that risk for outcome is really, really key. And so in my example where I said, we're trying to hit 50, if you only get 45, that provider is on the hook for figuring out how to get that next 5 or compensating you for missing that target, certainly depending on how you write out your contract. The other piece I talked about is the operational expense or the capital expense, depending on your financing need and what your P&L statement looks like, your corporate spreadsheet, if you will, of your balance sheet. You can do some of these projects if you take the programmatic approach as a off balance sheet. And so that's when you're looking at some of those energy as a service solutions where you're now paying for only what you get, and you're not tying that into your debt or having to show what that looks like. The last is that provider can help find applicable incentives. So working with that one singular provider who's spanning across all of those different geography locations is absolutely critical and important to make sure that they are on the hook and they're capable and they understand helping to find those applicable incentives. And they will be working through and navigating things like IRA and the alphabet soup, the different utilities and the rebates that can be approved, and how to make sure that the technologies and solutions tie into that. There are drawbacks to any approach that you take. Nothing is perfect, and there is no singular approach that you should take. When you look at the programmatic approach, it could be potentially higher first costs because the provider is taking on all of the risk for your project. They're going to build in the necessary risk factors. They're also going to have some financing involved in there. And so you need to think through what makes the most sense. And from a first cost perspective, it could be higher. It could be the smaller last costs, if you will, or total cost of the project. But it's an important part to think through. And then the other thing from a drawback perspective is the concept may be novel in your organization and may require socialization to gain adoption. When we think about the MUSH market, so municipalities, universities, schools, and healthcare, they've been purchasing in this programmatic sense for quite some time in ESPCs or performance contracting projects. When you move into some of the private money or the commercial and industrial space, they have not been purchasing this way. They've been largely spending money in that design, bid, build process. So understanding and moving into that space and really getting a good description and having a good concept so you can get that organizational alignment and communication within your organization is a space that you would need to think through. So I'm going to leave it there. I kept it pretty high level. I went in depth in some of the different spaces. I know we've got a lot of questions going through the Q&A, so Deborah's going to help me sift through those in just a moment here. But I want to hit a couple key points before we turn it over to Deborah. The first thing that's really important is driving your organizational alignment. Again, finding that North Star for why you're decarbonizing, what it means for the different silos, functions, streams, business units within your organization, and how we're going to make that happen, and how we're going to get everybody aligned, and how we'll have everybody say, I understand the WIFM, and I'm pretty jazzed about it. The next is understanding those levers of decarbonization. Where do you want to start? How do you want to sequence through it? And then how do you analyze your sites for attractiveness? How do you make sure that you're looking at all of the different improvement measures, how you are considering all those different components that tie into it, and how are you getting very simplistically to your green, yellow, and red dots for what you want to move through? And the last, or sometimes the first, is figuring out your implementation and financing approach. So if you know that you can't put this on balance sheet, you probably want to start there, thinking about what energy as a service could be, meaning you're paying for the decarbonization, you're paying for that as you go, or that's not important to you. And so, from there, that's where you can put it all together. And the last thing is simplistically just to execute, to go get those results that we're all so excited about, that we all join a call like this to talk about, is really, really key. And so I hope you've gained some perspective. Really excited to talk about this further and move into the questions and answers. And I think, Deborah, we maybe have a poll right before we go there, and then we'll have my contact information at the end for any of those that don't get an answer, or if you think of a question later and you want to follow up, my contact information will be there.
Great. Becky, thank you so much. You're like the best kind of nerd because you give really good information and you tell it very well. So thank you so much for that. Let's go to the poll question, then we'll talk a little bit more. Which descriptors resonate most with you? This is a select all that apply. And really what we're asking is when it comes to your journey to improve the environmental impact of your building and business, which of these terms resonates most with you or which, best describes your efforts? So is it sustainability, ESG, carbon reduction, greenhouse gas reduction, emissions reduction, or decarbonization? So take a moment and again, select all that apply, and then we'll see what our audience has to say. And while they're doing that, I love that when I listen to Becky. So WIFM has been on my mind a lot because she told me about that one once before. And now disaggregated versus programmatic is now going to be in my head because that was a really good description. So thank you for that. And I'll just remind you, get your questions in while we're waiting. And also, yes, somebody asked if this session was going to be recorded and if that recording would be available. And yes, everybody listening today or anybody that's registered will get that link in a follow-up probably tomorrow. So repeat viewing could be in your future. All right, let's see what our attendees have to say. A few more still coming in. I see. I get a little peek at what's coming in. Let's give you I won't do the countdown again, but you have 5 more seconds. So get those answers in. And let's see what we have here. All right, sustainability, number 1, about 3/4 of the audience. And greenhouse gas reduction, GHG, at about half, followed by emissions reduction, a little less than half. I missed one. Decarbonization, I didn't read that, but you all found it at almost half. And then carbon reduction, about 1/3, ESG, about 1/4. Again, Becky, I'm throwing this back to you. What do you think of these answers?
Deborah, my love and affection for buzzwords and what we attach our brains to and start understanding. It's really key. I mean, language is so important for humans and for all of us as we move into our organizations. So I'm certainly taking something away from this from our audience in how I can better communicate and how my teams can better communicate within the industry and as we lead the charge towards a more sustainable future. I'm going to use sustainability because that's the highest rated there. But also, I hope those who are listening can learn from this to use it when you're communicating within your organizations and as you're being change leaders within that group.
And I'm so glad that was really one of the pillars of what you talked about, change leadership. And I think it was the slides navigating the complexity. So much of the problems that we hear is this is not the core. Energy and sustainability are not the core of what these companies do, but it's a big part of their operations. So getting it, so to speak, to the top of the inbox and getting it as a priority is really important. So thank you for all that information. And we do have a lot of questions piling up. So let's just get started with those. And the first one, okay, it's a long one. If the local grid is not clean, it can feel like the best thing to do is implement renewables like solar right away. But you're saying to look at efficiency first. So how should we think about the grid emissions in prioritizing our decarbonization efforts?
That's a great question, Deborah. I really like it for a couple of reasons. One, it is something I hear regularly around my grid is dirty. I actually had someone say, hey, we live in this location, we roll dirty. And, it became kind of a joke with that customer. But when we think about the grid, depending on the utility that you're in or the ISO, if you will, it's going to look different today. But there are goals and there are targets within the DOE, looking at getting to 100%, carbon free in terms of 2035, 2050, those sort of targets. So what we need to think about as we're designing our projects is what is the nexus of our goal? If we have a 2030 goal, the grid is probably not going to be at 100% by 2030. If we have a 2050 goal, that's probably something we can rely on. So as we're sorting through what is our asset stack in terms of what does our equipment look like, do we want to electrify, do we not want to electrify, do we want to make decisions based on the grid? That's a key place to think about it. But overall, what I would say is you need to build in those factors, but generally speaking, snapping the chalk line and what your grid looks like today is a risk because it's going to be improving as time goes forward. All of the utilities are becoming businesses, and it's good business for them to be moving towards renewables. So look at your goal, look at what you have today, think about where that may make sense. But big picture, if I were to boil all that down and say, let's make it super, super simple, I would say the key thing is to understand how much efficiency you need before you look at your renewables. Are you going to potentially buy too many renewables because you haven't looked at reducing the energy usage of your facility? So those would be the simple answer and the complex answer for that question.
Good. I like that you gave us a choice of going either way. So thank you for that.
I'm not always nerdy.
All right, staying on the subject of energy efficiency, here's our next question. When it comes to energy efficiency, are there any specific solutions that produce outsized energy or carbon reduction results?
You know, Deborah, that is a dangerous question. And why I say that is I think it's human nature to say, how easy can I make this? How can I simplify the decision that I need to make? And so we start saying, well, what's the silver bullet? What's the one thing I can do across? And that's where we start to run into those challenges. And if you think about the 3 challenges I threw out today for our customers, it's try to out-renewable the problem. Because if you just have to write a contract for renewables across all your space, that's pretty simple. It's, hey, I'm just going to look at one facility and I'm just going to start there and only do that one facility. Again, you're simplifying it. You're narrowing down the part of your challenge that you're looking at. And then the other one is very much that horizontal approach of what's that one technology I can implement across all of my facilities to get the greatest bang for the buck. And so my answer to that question is, please don't do that. Again, my very simple answer, but my more complex answer is it's really challenging. We certainly see some energy conservation measures that tend to have more green dots than others. But the better approach is to look at holistically all of your different options and pick them off as they stack up in terms of dollar per pound or dollar per energy saved. Whatever unit you're going to use is a more effective way to go about it.
Okay, thanks for that. And the next one, not really a question, just a statement, but it's kind of a shout out. Because I love the 4-step sequence. That sequence is the wisest path forward in greening facilities. So you got a nice pat on the back with that one. That resonated with some of our audience.
Great.
And let's go back to an actual question and answer, but I like the shout out, so thanks. All right, next, are there any special considerations for decarbonizing buildings with critical needs, like a hospital?
Yes, absolutely there are. One of the items I didn't touch on much today, but it's kind of like the cousin to the decarbonization effort is if you will, is starting to look at resiliency and starting to look at things like I don't want to get nerdy into microgrids or on-site generation, but when you think about those critical infrastructures, there's 2 pieces that you need to understand. One, what is your critical load, and how do you make sure that you drive energy efficiency within that critical load first? So that if you do need to support it, and if you do have a weather event or a grid event, that you can minimize how much generation you need to do, that's a really key piece to look at. The other thing that you should look at is going back to that mission objective and understanding your Northstar is when you're in a space like a hospital, and the number one thing that a hospital does is not decarbonize its facility, it's helping either doctors and nurses and medical staff support their patients, giving patients an environment where they can heal. And there are some absolutely critical moments within that journey that a patient goes through in a hospital. So it's absolutely layering in where are those spaces that we need to make sure we don't have a failure point. And so that ties in with the critical nature, but understanding within that facility, where are those critical moments, and that patient care is at the forefront of every decision you make is absolutely important to be able to pull into the equation and communicate back out as you're selecting which projects that you do.
Okay, great, thank you. And our next question, what is an example of fuel switching?
Fuel switching, that's a great question. We can get nerdy within it, but really it's understanding how you want to, whether it's heat or generation, et cetera, how you want to pick which one that you're using. So if you think about it from a, I talked about Minnesota earlier, right? We have the requirement around dual fuel. So as much as I want to say I have a heat pump and that's all I use and I don't have any natural gas hooked up to my furnace, I do, because it's required by state code. And so, depending on where my environment is at, it can use one of the different fuels. Same thing, you can see that within power generation between, are we going to use diesel or are we going to use renewables? And so being able to have that selection space and make the right choice at the right time is pretty key as we start moving into some of that space in how we're going to actually execute these projects.
Okay, great. And we've got another question here, and they like the topic that I like. They say, what is your advice for convincing hesitant leadership, especially for more novice solutions? So again, navigating internally. What's your advice there?
Yeah, that organizational alignment. I'm hesitating to call it organizational drag because I don't think your leader would love to hear that term used. They prefer things like alignment, but driving organizational alignment is key in helping your business understand what's the point of what we're trying to do and what is that WIFM for the different departments. And so, one of my favorite projects that we did was with Neiman Marcus, and one of the groups that we had to convince there was the marketing group that they're a little bit resistant to it, and not because they're bad people. They were just trying to understand, like, I want to do solar panels, not replace HVAC infrastructure, but showing them how they could use that to market it and show themselves as a green organization and get more people excited about shopping at Neiman Marcus was important to getting that over the finish line. And so, it goes back to that driving towards your North Star and aligning with all the different groups within your organization. And sometimes it'll be easy. And it's a very clear alignment in terms of, hey, facilities, do you want some new stuff so it's not breaking so often? They're generally pretty on board with that. Other organizations and groups within your company can be more challenged, but really try to think about it from their perspective. And lining in that math, that new math is a challenge. So thinking through that space, working with a great teammate that can work you through the different options really makes a big difference.
All right, so I think we're going to end on that one. Of course, we have to end with new math because that's just my favorite thing. But it's good that there are people out there, Becky, like you, that can explain all that to us. Thank you so much. We're out of time for today. Becky, thanks again. I really just love hearing you talk about all this. You make it very clear, and you have some great advice for us, for our audience. So thank you for that. Thank you for the team at Trane for helping to put all this together. It's a pleasure working with you all. And thanks to all our attendees. Good questions. If you have any more, sneak them in, and the team will get back to you when we're offline. And don't forget to join us again for our next webinar when we're back with our series. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.